Today we're jumping into a massive historical debate, a story about empire, money, and power. And we're going to do it by looking at one of the most powerful companies that has ever existed, the British East India Company.
You know, for centuries, this one question has sparked so much debate. Was British rule a total drain on India's economy, or did it actually help build the foundation for the country we know today?
But here's the crazy part. A new paper suggests the answer isn't buried in some long-lost diary. It's been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Where? In the empire's own account books. The proof might just be in their own numbers.
So you ready? Let's follow the money. Okay, so first things first, we've got to understand the two sides of this story, because this isn't just some dusty old debate. It really shapes how we see the whole colonial period.
All right, so on one side, you've got what's called the nationalist view. The argument here is that Britain basically set up a system to just drain wealth from India, leaving behind poverty and holding back its economy. But then, on the other side, there's the revisionist view. This school of thought says, hey, wait a minute, India had its own problems before the British showed up. They argue that British rule was actually a good thing, bringing stability, security, and even key infrastructure like railways. I mean, we're talking about two totally opposite stories about the exact same piece of history.
So the source we're diving into today is a 2020 paper from economist Pilar Nogues Marcos. And what she did is brilliant. She went straight to the horse's mouth. She analyzed the budgets that the East India Company, or the EIC, had to turn into the British Parliament. And get this, these aren't just some fuzzy estimates. This is the company's own accounting of its rule in India.
Okay, so if we're gonna follow the money, we have to start where it all began for the EIC, its income. And the number one source, by a long shot, was land.
50%. Just think about that. The IEC's tax collectors were demanding up to half of everything a farmer produced. Now, to be fair, high taxes weren't totally new. They were sometimes a holdover from the Mughal rulers. But the big difference was how the EIC collected them. They were relentless, super rigid, and systematic. There was no room for a bad harvest or a family crisis. The tax was due, period.
And as you can imagine, this had a devastating human cost. The paper's author found that agricultural laborers were literally living below subsistence levels. What does that mean? It means their entire income was spent on just the cheapest possible food to survive. There was zero, and I mean zero, left over for anything else. It was a life lived constantly on the very edge of starvation.
So the EIC is raking in all this cash from taxes. The obvious next question is, where did it all go?
And wow, this chart really tells the story, doesn't it? Take a look. A whopping 68% of all spending went to the military. Now remember the revisionist argument? They'd say, well, that's the price of stability and security. But when you look at the EIC's own numbers, you have to ask, security for who? Now compare that huge military chunk to that tiny little sliver down there, just 3%. That's all that went to public works, things that would actually benefit the people of India.
And this is so important, because we're not just talking about budget priorities here. We're talking about life and death. In a place like India, where everything depends on the monsoons, irrigation is absolutely critical. So when people say the British brought infrastructure, this is where it gets complicated. The EIC's own books show that they let existing irrigation systems, canals, reservoirs, the whole deal, just fall apart. So when a drought inevitably came, that neglect meant a water shortage turned into a full-blown, catastrophic famine.
Okay, now we get to the trickiest part of this whole investigation. It's a bit complex, but it might be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. It's this idea that India was sending tons and tons of goods to Britain and getting paid nothing for them.
All right, let's break this down step by step. First, the EIC did some pretty sneaky accounting. They basically mixed their government money with their business money all in the same books. Second, they used the tax money they collected from Indians to buy Indian goods, like spices and textiles, to then ship back to Britain. So think about that. It wasn't British money paying for these exports, it was India's own tax money being used to buy its own goods. And then the final move, and this is a wild one, in 1833, the British Parliament just declared that all of the EIC's debt, including its business and trade debt, was now India's problem. The Indian taxpayers were on the hook for all of it. It was a brilliant and ruthless bit of accounting that basically turned trade into tribute.
There's actually a term for this, unrequited exports. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's not really trade, right? It's just a one-way street. Wealth and goods are flowing out of a country, and absolutely nothing of value is flowing back in to pay for it.
So, this paper doesn't just lay out the theory. It actually goes into the EIC's ledgers and puts a number on this drain of wealth. So, what was the final tally?
13%, the final number, calculated from the company's own records, is just staggering. By 1858, which is when the British government officially took over from the EIC, the value of all those unpaid-for exports was equal to 13% of India's entire economy. To give you some perspective on that, that's more than what most countries today spend on healthcare. It's a huge, huge number.
So, at the end of the day, after following the money, the paper's conclusion is pretty clear-cut. While some historians point to the stability and infrastructure the British brought, the empire's own account books seem to tell a very different story. It's a story of incredibly high taxes, military spending that mostly benefited the empire, and a very clever financial system that was basically designed to move wealth out of India. The paper argues that these numbers offer real, hard evidence for that drain of wealth theory.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about, doesn't it? What if all that wealth, 13% of the entire country's output, had stayed in India? What if it had been invested in Indian infrastructure, Indian businesses, and the Indian people? What might have been different?